In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Welcome back to the Daily Memphian's Memphis Grizzlies podcast. This is your host, Drew Hill, joined as always by Chris Herrington. Definitely one of the more difficult podcasts that has existed in Memphis Grizzlies lore. Tragic news for the Grizzlies came in on Tuesday morning. Chris and I were in Chicago for the NBA Combine, so we have not had a chance to record until today. But Brandon Clarke passed away at the age of 29 on Monday in an area close to Los Angeles. And obviously, there's been a lot of reaction to that from Grizzlies fans, folks around the league, players on the team, thoughtful message from Jaren Jackson Jr., who was one of Brandon Clarke's closest friends. So I know we had a lot of draft coverage and stuff this week. Obviously, it's really hard to find the timing for a lot of this stuff, Chris, and it's very difficult to capture it, and it almost feels secondary, some of the other Grizzlies news. But we can start with just obviously what were some of your thoughts from the tragic news that came earlier this week.
Yeah, obviously we were both in Chicago for the Combine when the news started trickling out. So were all of the Grizzlies decision makers, or most of them, by the way, and other people connected with the franchise. And I think everyone associated with the Grizzlies would have liked to have just hit pause on the whole draft combine thing and said, we could revisit this later. But it's an NBA thing, and it wasn't going to work that way. That sort of had to go on, so everyone had to sort of deal with the Brandon Clarke news and deal with the combine at the same time. There was really no choice there. It's obviously a terrible, terrible thing, and it's the kind of thing you don't expect to be confronting or dealing with because it's something that doesn't happen. And when we were both writing about it, you and Jody Callahan did an initial news story on it, and then you and I collaborated on a piece trying to take a step back and more of an appreciation of Brandon's life and his time in Memphis specifically, and just trying to think about the context of it. The last time an active NBA player, an established, I should say, there's another player who had played 14 games in the NBA and was on a roster since then. But the last time an established NBA player died while still active was 20 years ago. That was Eddie Griffin of the Minnesota Timberwolves, who died in a car crash. And, there have been deaths in the Grizzlies family that were unexpected over the years. Don Poyer, who was if you're at FedEx Forum, you see there's a banner in his honor. They're in FedEx Forum. The media center is named after him. He'd come from Vancouver. He was beloved. He died unexpectedly of a heart attack in the middle of a season. Lorenzen Wright's then 11-month-old daughter Sierra died of SIDS while he was the starting center while he was on a team road trip, and that was a very heavy day, obviously, for the Grizzlies. Lorenzen himself, as everyone knows, was killed. That was after he had, I don't know if he had technically retired, but after his career, he was no longer a player for the Grizzlies, but obviously a Memphis person, in addition to a Grizzlies person. I mean, those were rough days, but for a player to die while a member of the team is something that the franchise had never experienced, and very few franchises have ever experienced. It hasn't happened that often in the history of the game, I don't think. And so it was terrible. And Brandon Clarke was not just a player on the roster. I think it's fair to say, a beloved player by both fans and teammates and people in the organization and coaches and executives and across the board. He was extremely well liked by everyone. He was always a positive presence on the team, in the organization. And he had also had, I think, an unusual longevity for someone, a player of his type, an unusual importance maybe for a player of his type. He had been with the organization for 7 seasons. There are several other players who have also had done 7 seasons with the Grizzlies, including Tony Allen and to this point John Morant. But the only players ever, and I'm including Vancouver, who had been with the organization more than 7 seasons, are Jaren Jackson Jr., Marcus All, Mike Conley, and Zach Randolph. That's it. Those are the only players in franchise history who have been with the Grizzlies longer than the Brandon Clarke 7 seasons. And he is someone who I think helped establish a style and the personality of the team in his era. I think he was very important to that. I think he is someone who had big moments for the team. We wrote about, him stepping up in a big way when they beat the Minnesota Timberwolves in 2022, the only playoff series win of the era, only one of five in franchise history. He was someone who was memorable, who was important, who was well liked on and off the floor. Just a really important part of the story of this franchise. And for him to die at age 29 is just a terrible thing.
One of the saddest pieces to this is that because the arrest happened, and that made major news, I think that the casual basketball fan that knows nothing about Memphis or Brandon Clarke can't really put their finger on or understand the type of person that he was in the locker
Right.
room and why fans liked him so much. They're just going to view him as, potentially a troubled individual. And like Brandon was so much more than that during his time in Memphis. And just brief tangent. I remember when I first got the Grizzlies job, it was Brandon's rookie year when I was covering the team. And like my family, I grew up in Kentucky. My mom's from Ohio. Like there was no NBA basketball connection, like whatever. And, my parents were excited for me to get the opportunity. And so my mom started watching NBA basketball probably for the first time in her life. And she used to say, when she would come to Memphis, she used to say, you know, what guys treat you the best? Who's the nicest? Like, I want to be a fan of those guys. Those are the players that I want to be a fan of. And I used to always tell her Brandon Clarke, and I'll never
Right.
forget when she came to Memphis for the first time, she bought a Brandon Clarke t-shirt at the team store because she was excited about Brandon Clarke. She was like, I love the way he plays. The guy's always smiling. He's a nice guy, to everybody on and off the floor. And that was Brandon. Like, that was always Brandon, And he was one of the players that would stay afterwards in the locker room and would talk to us about whatever it was. He used to crack jokes with Jaren. It was always really entertaining and funny to listen to the two of them go back and forth about whatever it may be. A lot of it like just life, not that doesn't have anything to do with basketball. And like those two were like two peas in a pod, and it was great to be around.
Yeah.
And that's what makes us hurt so bad is because then it becomes like a personal thing. And I'm just really sad for the team, really sad for the fans. It's a really difficult situation. It's a really sensitive thing to talk about, so it's almost hard to come on here and
Well,
podcast about it for me. But
he had been in addition in terms of like the processing of it for fans and people around. I mean, to sort of elaborate on what you were talking about this season. He's been sort of absent this season, right? He only played 2 games, and one of those he played 3 minutes. And then because of the arrest situation, he didn't do a closing media session. He didn't do it the final media session, after the season when the guys, typically sit at the podium. But he also didn't do it in the locker room when they did it with all the other injured players, right? The Zach Edey and Scottie Pippen, all those guys sort of had their moment to like talk about their season. Like Brandon Clarke didn't have that exit interview moment. And because he only played the 2 games, he wasn't that. I mean, I think I interacted with him twice during the season this season. One of those was his return game, which was in Minnesota. I was there for that game. And I wrote about it that night and I talked to him about it that night, but it didn't seem like that big of a deal because it seemed like he was going to keep playing more games, right? He came back, he played really well, he looked good. it was more of a check-in on that, and then expectation that I had and that he had, or he was just going to keep on playing, right? We were going to get a lot more Brandon Clarke, and then the next game he played 3 minutes. The calf started bothering him, and they set him down. The last interaction I had with him was actually a fist bump. It was in the locker room later in the season when he was still rehabbing the calf, but before the team had officially shut him down, right? Um, and who knows whether if the tanking stuff had happened, whether he would have been able to come back and play. I suspect not. But he had not been officially shut down. So it seemed like he was still trying to get back on the floor. And I remember being in the locker room one night and he happened to be in there, which he wasn't all the time because he wasn't playing. And I just turned to him. I said, how's the calf going? How's it coming along? And he said, I'm working on it. It's coming along okay. And I just said, I miss seeing you out there. So I hope it comes along well. And he just reached out and gave me a fist bump. And that was the last time I interacted with him.
Yeah, and another part that's really tragic about this is that I don't think he had much of a chance to really interact or, be in the public eye in Memphis all that much at all because as you mentioned, the game he played was in Minnesota.
Right.
The following game he gets injured, so he
Three
doesn't
minutes.
talk
Yeah.
after the game,
Right.
which means I think the last time that he had talked in Memphis publicly, like on the record, was, media day before the season probably. And so that's difficult. But what I remember, the last interaction that I remember with Brandon was his birthday, or the day before his birthday, actually, when he went to KIPP Collegiate Academy, which is a charter school in Memphis. And, he was in the hallway waiting to go into the classroom thinking he was going to surprise the kids, but the teachers had actually told the kids that he was coming and that they were going to surprise him and sing happy birthday. And he stood in the hallway and told us all about how he had come up with the idea. He wanted to start his own foundation. That was something he had wanted to do for a long time. He had seen the way that Jaron had had an impact on the community and wanted to do something similar. And this was off the record, right? This was not conversation. This was not like a formal interview. And that was just him being him. And, that was the last birthday he had. And that is incredibly sad to think about. But I think the other part of this, and we maybe haven't even touched on it enough, is that he ultimately was a very great basketball success story. A
Yeah.
guy that was born in Canada but raised in Arizona and was a zero-star recruit out of high school, who played, against Marvin Bagley and Marcus Howard and some of the top players in the country, and still really never, got the attention that he probably deserved. Goes to San Jose State, then goes to Gonzaga. Gonzaga becomes a national power, and even then he gets doubted because he goes to the draft and he's supposed to be a first-round draft pick, and he has what he believes is multiple promises that'll go in the top 11, and he ends up getting picked 21st because his measurements weren't good or whatever. And he always had like that unorthodox game. He was the king of the floater. He really found a way to fit. I know. I mean, you captured it in the story that we wrote together to kind of reflect on his time with the Grizzlies and his life in general. But like that Minnesota series was the peak of the last Grizzlies era, and he was at the center of it.
It was an emergency situation. Taylor Jenkins felt that the matchup was bad for Steven Adams against Karl Anthony Towns. He pulls Steven Adams. Tillman comes in, has one really good game, but then, the clock kind of strikes midnight on that. The Grizzlies lose game one at home. They're fighting from behind the whole series. Brandon Clarke was a savior in that series. And to this day, people around the Minnesota Timberwolves, and I know Minnesota coach Chris Finch has mentioned this in the past, like they think of Brandon Clarke as the guy who flipped that series. For Memphis. That's one of 5 series wins in franchise history. I did a series over the course of the year on called Grizzlies 25 best players in franchise history. Brandon Clarke was obviously on the list. I had him at 17. The essay I wrote about him, I called him sort of the franchise sixth man because he played fewer than 7% of the games he played for the Grizzlies in his career were as a starter. He was a bench guy, right? Bench guys don't last 7 seasons with one team, and bench guys don't make that kind of impact. it's a testament to how good he was and sort of his style that he was so important. And part of that was the way he complemented the stars of his era, John Morant and Jaren Jackson. With Ja, I mean, he was the other end of that alley oop exchange, right? That really created that excitement and that style of play. That he helped weaponize Ja's passing. Ja helped weaponize his ability to jump and all of that. But he also had this incredible on court and off court in different ways relationship with Jaren Jackson Jr., where they were great friends off the floor, and it was really painful to see Jaren's, understandably delayed reaction. He didn't come out right out of the gate. He clearly had to process this. And then on the court, they just sort of had this thing about them where, Jaren could play on the outside on offense, and that gave Brandon Clarke room to operate. And Jaren could protect the rim, and Clarke could guard all over the place. And they just had this great chemistry. And like it seemed like whenever they were both healthy on the floor together, the Grizzlies were just great with those guys on the floor. And so Clarke was just so important to both the success and to the personality of the team. And when we think about sort of the way this era sort of took a downturn, a lot of that focuses on obviously the John Morant stuff. But before that night in Denver started with Brandon Clarke's Achilles injury.
I know that's so often forgotten, but I will not forget that night, not because of what happened with the jaw that led to the
Right.
first jaw suspension, but because that was a locker room that was in shambles after the game.
Yeah.
Which frankly made it even more unthinkable that what happened later that night happened
Right. Right.
because it was so depressing
Right.
in the locker room because everybody was hurting for Brandon Clarke so much.
Right.
And yeah, it's just, you know, terrible news that's hard to capture. I mean, the story is not over. There will be more, but
Right.
none of that is appropriate really to talk about right now. So I just
We have.
wanted,
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I just was going to say, I just wanted us to make sure we came on here and celebrated Brandon Clarke, the basketball player.
Well, we're going to have to talk about the draft combine, obviously. But let me segue by giving more than a shout out. Give a real nod of appreciation to one particular player at the NBA draft combine. That was Trayvon Brazile of the University of Arkansas. I think we collectively, between the two of us, we talked to like 70 players yesterday as we record. And I'm talking to Trayvon Brazile, and I'm even thinking about it. And I mentioned that I covered the Memphis Grizzlies, and he just stopped me in the middle of my question, said, "My condolences on Brandon Clarke," like immediately. He was the only person, and not to I didn't expect anyone to say anything about it, but it really caught me off guard, and I really appreciated that from him. So, real nod of appreciation to Trayvon Brazile.
Yeah, difficult segue, but we need to do it. So let's go ahead and do it. So you, obviously, I was in the air and then writing the Brandon Clarke story as a lot of the early combine stuff was going on with the measurements and the testing. Can we just start before we get into players that the Grizzlies have talked to and that sort of thing? Like, was there anybody that you think won the combine, or who are the combine winners in your eyes?
I was in the gym a little bit more than you, but I was also not in the gym as much as I would have been because when we were both working on the Brandon Clarke one of the Brandon Clarke stories, and then obviously on the phone and just distracted by it. But I made a point of watching the workout section that included Cameron Boozer and Caleb Wilson and other front court players, and then obviously looked at the measurements, and we were there for one of the scrimmage games for a little bit. I think a guy that jumped out, I think everyone is noting, is Cameron Carr. Will that jump him up high enough where he might be considered by the Grizzlies at number 16? I don't know, maybe, but he's a guy, Cameron Carr from Baylor, measured with the longest wingspan relative to height of anybody at the combine in terms of the plus, right? He was like a +8. He had the highest vertical of any player projected as a first round pick. He had the second highest overall. He shot 40% from three at Baylor last year. So with the shooting stuff, I care more about like their shooting numbers in their college career than in one like shooting drill.
Yeah, a 25 shot sample size
Right.
isn't exactly an
Although I
appropriate.
did, with the Boozer and Wilson stuff, just let me wrap up with Cameron Carr, but Carr was interesting. And then in the scrimmage, he was the proverbial too good for the scrimmage. People joking, is the agent going to go pull him off the floor? And he sure enough did not play the second scrimmages today. He was also impressive. He was one of the guys I said it on during his media session. I thought he came across really well to me. And very serious. Like someone asked him, like, who are you going to work out with? Maybe it was me. I don't remember. Was asking about who he was going to work out with. He just said, I don't even know. My mama told me just be wherever your feet are at. I'm going to be in a gym somewhere. Like I'll go anywhere. It sounded like he had not had a lot of workouts to this point, but I think he's about to have a whole lot more. That's a guy who really helped himself at the combine. As far as the Boozer Wilson stuff, and it remains to be seen whether that'll be the choice for the Grizzlies at 3. I mean, that's something we'll be talking about for the next 6 weeks. But I was going to say on the shooting drill, I don't care that much about the makes and the misses in it's one shooting drill. But for someone who had not seen these guys play in person, I was watching pretty closely like shooting mechanics. And it was really noticeable to me with those guys. When you talk about a set shot, a catch and shoot shot, Cameron Boozer's shot like was going left came off of his fingertips with a high soft arc, repetitive motion, like it looked really sound. And you could see with Caleb Wilson, the shot seemed to be being pushed off sort of more the middle of his fingers instead of the fingertips. The arc was a little bit more knucklebally. It seemed a little bit more erratic. And sure enough, in the catch and shoot stuff, Boozer shot way better. I will note when they got into more of like the mid range, off the dribble, off movement, the kind of stuff where it's where maybe you're not. It's not as mechanically oriented. It's a little bit more feel oriented. That the gap closed on those guys. I thought Boozer had the measurements with Boozer, I think, were meaningfully good relative to what you might have thought with him. I mean, everyone knows he's not like Nikola Jokic. He's not a 7-footer, but all of his measurements, height, wingspan, standing reach, the whole thing are all better than Kevin Love's was at his combine 20 years ago, right? And we saw the career he had. They're very similar to Al Horford, Julius Randle. His physical dimensions are that type, which is great powered forward size, and it's big enough to play small ball 5. It's good measurements for him. Wilson came in an inch taller, but wingspan an inch shorter, which I think is surprising. It's funny, all season long, I've been reading stuff about Wilson's incredible length, and I think people have been talking about how much he jumps, right? The length is actually not incredible. And if you look at the other guys he's been compared to, Kevin Garnett, Pascal Siakam, Chris Bosh, Jaren Jackson, all these guys, all of those guys are way, way longer than him, actually. He does jump out of the gym, though. And so it's an interesting, different physical dimension where Boozer's a little bit longer, Wilson's a little bit taller, Boozer's 40 pounds heavier, Wilson jumps a lot higher. It's just choose your flavor, right? But it is a contrast.
Yeah, I thought Boozer was a winner, of the combine because of how well he performed, especially in the agility testing.
Yeah.
The side-by-side video is kind of jarring of him and Wilson because Wilson's got a lot more going on. Like it feels like Boozer's not even giving effort, but he's faster in the agility drills. Now, it's different on the actual court, but I thought he was definitely a winner. Peterson, I mean, shot it really well in all the shooting drills like you would expect, measured really well for everything you would expect. I think what I was hoping was for like a little bit more liveliness maybe through the interview section.
Yeah, maybe you can talk to us about that because the way these interview sessions worked, we sort of split up. So we were rarely talking to the same guys. So you talked to Peterson. So
like? A little bit more context. They basically will throw like 15 guys in a room at one time.
Right.
And they will talk for like 10 or 15 minutes. And then they move on to the next group and they'll throw another 15 in the same room. They'll do that 3 times and then they'll do it. Yeah.
You gotta choose your own adventure because no individual person can talk to everybody in the room.
So it was awesome that both Chris and I were there because we could literally go split the room in half and talk to everyone to figure out who was working out for Memphis and all. So shout out to the Daily Memphian. It was a great choice, I think, to send both of us. We got a lot of stuff. But I had Peterson, and I did think that, I don't know. The personality stuff is definitely a question with him because of the touch and go availability in the games and the questions behind these full body cramps. And, there's a story that tries to lend legitimacy to why he didn't play in some of these games. And maybe it is fully the truth. But I just was curious to see how he was going to come across publicly. Obviously I wasn't expecting Cam Boozer, whose like dad was a professional and seems to be like the most polished, you know,
Right.
talker slash player in the draft. But I found it interesting that Peterson said like one of the things that's one of my top priorities here is to make sure these teams understand who I am because so much has been said about me at this point. And so I want them to know the real me, essentially. But man, I like those just for that to be like in question, maybe could be a little uneasy, I guess, for some teams. Like
Right.
that you're having to play a guessing game of who's the real Darren Peterson. Um, and he was super soft spoken, like really quiet on the microphone, all of that. But I mean, as far as the testing went, he did really well. The other interesting player, and you mentioned Wilson being compared to Jaren Jackson and Kevin Garnett,
There's
whatever,
a lot of Garnett, Bosch, and Siakam. Yeah.
Bosch and Siakam. Maybe the player that fits better, if you're going to go based on the measurements, is Yaxel Lendenborg. So he was a really interesting interview to me. The same way that Zach Edey kind of raised my antenna the year that I went to the combine with how enthusiastic he was to talk about the Grizzlies and Memphis. Yaxel kind of did the same for me in this instance because, you know, some people are like, well, why is he talking about the University of Memphis? First of all, I wrote the story. I did ask him about it. I was like, you've played in Memphis a lot. Like, do you have any thoughts about Memphis? And that's when he said, "Oh, I have a bad taste in my mouth about playing the University of Memphis." And he basically he was 1-3 against the Tigers in the regular season. Dane Danger ate his lunch a couple of times, and so yeah, I can imagine he probably does. But he did express enthusiasm about playing for the Grizzlies, potentially being in Memphis, and he said that they shared interest. Like he was interested in going to Memphis. Was interested in getting him, and gave one of those quotes where it was like, yeah. Wouldn't it be great if I could somehow end up on the Grizzlies? Like, and that's not something you always hear players say. And like in terms of his profile, everything screams like Grizzlies to me. Everything except for age. That's it.
I mean, if he were there at 16, sure, but I have a hard time, and maybe they'll prove me wrong. If they take a forward at three, and like, hey, if Darren Peterson's the guy who drops a three and they take Peterson, maybe the whole complexion of this thing changes. But if they were to take a Boozer or a Wilson at three, I had a hard time seeing them spend resources to trade up for a Yaxel Lindenberg. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and the one thing that it didn't occur to me in the moment, but I had since thought about afterwards, to your point, is him saying I met with Memphis and there's mutual interest. Well, a lot of this stuff was also conducted before the lottery actually happened.
Oh, okay.
I wonder if those
Yeah.
conversations were happening then when Memphis thought it was going to have
Oh,
five,
if they
six,
were
seven, and they were going to draft a guard, and then they were going to trade back up to get a player like
right,
Yaxel.
or like
I don't know.
they could have been pushed down to 8 or 9. You didn't know. I mean, at that point, maybe you don't like the guard that's left, and so there's that.
I mean,
Yeah, no, that
it's really crazy, but what if the Grizzlies just totally love one of the guards? I don't know. It
What's
seems,
interesting to me, and we didn't, I mean, there were like 70 something players. I think we talked to most of them, maybe not all of them. I don't know. We know that the Grizzlies win is a different question. We know that they have talked to LeBaron Philon, Christian Anderson, and Ibuka Okori.
an
Those
A
are all
cuff,
guys.
an A cuff.
Have they? Okay. Well, Acuff's not a guy who's going to be there at 16, or not a guy you would easily trade up to from that spot. Those are all guards that, like, if you take a big or forward at three, that you could be looking at 16. Corey and Anderson, I think would be there at 16. A Corey might be there at 16. Phylon could drop. There's a lot of guards. Like, they probably won't all go like 5 through 10, right? Somebody might slip.
Yeah. Um, the Michael Brown interview was interesting. And
Okay.
again, just to kind of explain how the combine works for people that don't know, when the scrimmages end, excuse me, when the scrimmages end, they have pro days for certain agencies afterwards. And so Michael had his pro day today. We're recording this on Thursday night. Um, Michael had his pro day today and apparently performed extremely well. A player that once upon a time was thought of with the Boozers and the DeBansas of the class, of
Right.
like thought to be the best guard. And I found his interview to be interesting because he was asked a lot of different. He had mystery around him too at Louisville with the back and why wasn't he playing, and like even in Louisville's most important games of the season he was absent. And so he received questions like, you know, is there anything that you think is a misconception about you or and stuff like of that nature? And he basically was like, no, I don't think so. I think everybody's pretty much hit it right on the head. And then when I asked him about the Grizzlies, he initially said yes, that he had met with the Grizzlies. And then I brought up the fact that there's a Grizzlies connection to the coaching staff in Louisville. And then he said, wait a minute, the Grizzlies, well, I don't know. If I meet with the Grizzlies, I'm gonna have to talk to my people to basically make a decision on if that's something we want to do. And so, and that was his answer to multiple teams. There was like a lot of Dallas folks there
Right.
asking him about the Mavericks. I'm going to meet with my people and decide if I want to meet with the Mavericks. And so it seemed like he was maybe a little bit going to be a little bit more selective in trying to direct where he
Yeah,
wanted to
I
go.
mean, different players were more forthcoming than others. Morez Johnson was someone who basically he sort of almost made it sound like he hadn't talked to anybody, which I know is not true. It was like I don't know. My agent handles all that. Clearly, he has talked to people. He's another guy, by the way, who had a very strong combine. He measured very well and across the board on the physical stuff, like really popped on the drills. I also want to give a shout out to his dog, a golden doodle. Somebody asked him, like, what's your ideal day, in your college town? That's how the question was phrased. He said, just hanging at home with my dog. And he was asked, well, what kind of dog do you have? He said, a golden doodle. So shout out to Morez Johnson and his golden doodle.
Tell us about Luigi Swigo.
Yeah, that was an interesting conversation. I'm talking to him for probably longer than I needed to. Probably missed a couple guys because of that. So he's a guy who sort of has entered the process late. No one was really talking about him much. I will give a shout out to the guy who does the Bleacher Report stuff, Jonathan Wasserman, because he had him like in deep second round of his mock draft like 3 months ago. The only place I'd seen this guy mentioned. And then he's popped up. He is a 7'3", I think 19-year-old center who played professionally in Italy and is testing the draft process. And it sounds pretty clear that if he does not stay in the draft, it will not be to go back to Europe. It will be to go to college here in the U.S. Villanova, most likely. He said Villanova or BYU. Sounds like Villanova, most likely. He did say that he had met with the Grizzlies that morning. This was, I think, was this Wednesday when we talked to him. So he had met with the Grizzlies that morning, had a sit down with them, which he said went well. So clearly there's some interest there because there's only so many hours in the day. You can't talk to everybody. He was on their list of guys they asked for. Zach Edey is the only center on the roster. They have to add, I think, more than one additional big to the roster. The complication, so Swigo is like 7'3". Apparently he can shoot from the perimeter, like a little bit of a ball of clay, but a really interesting guy because of that size. There just aren't a lot of guys like that. Like Adai Mar is the only other guy like that in this draft. The complication there is that he told me flat out, like if I'm not top 20, it doesn't make sense to stay in the draft because I'll get more money if I go to Villanova, basically. So it sounds like he's going to want a top 20 promise to stay in the draft. I don't think the Grizzlies or anyone else would I'd be surprised. Like it sounds like more like a guy you'd want to take at 32 than a guy at 16. You could always trade up from 32. So I don't know. But clearly the Grizzlies have some interest in there. It could be something you file away for like a year from now, right? When he's in the 2027 draft.
Yeah, you don't want to be a second round pick with a non-guaranteed contract, you know.
Well, you can tell, you could basically, if you're a high second round pick, you're going to get multi-years guaranteed. Like if you're pick 32, you're going to get at least 2 years guaranteed. But
Yeah.
you're talking about maybe $5 million there, and Villanova might give you that, just for this season, right? So who knows?
A couple other players. Uh, Alan Graves is interesting. Um, one of the BPM darlings of the freshman
Right.
class at Santa Clara. A hit the big shot against Kentucky right before they made the half court shot to send the game to overtime. And again, a player that shot better than 60% at the rim, 40% from three, was not a highly regarded recruit coming out of high school. That's why he ends up there. If he goes back to school, he will end up at either LSU, he's from Louisiana, or at Duke.
Right.
So similar to the Cedric Coward story here. Um, He's a player that I could see Memphis maybe. I mean, I don't know. It's on the wing, so maybe there's too much duplication there. But has good size, can move.
I
Is
think
maybe one of the good draft mysteries here, and one that was enthusiastic about Memphis, and they had their meeting, and
I
uh,
think
yeah,
I think he's going to be a four. I think he's going to be a four, and I think his game is sort of similar to Boozer, but without the strength and without some of those physical capabilities. The guys he reminds me of are like Jared Dudley to go like an older school guy, Kenrich Williams of OKC. 6'9", can shoot. Obviously has great hands and anticipation, and that shows up in the offensive rebounding and some of the steals and deflections and that kind of stuff. He did not test well athletically. I bet Jared Dudley back in the day did not test well athletically either, and he had a 10-year NBA career. So yeah, we'll see on that one.
um, and then last two. There's more in the story if you want to go read.
There's a lot more. There's a lot, and multiple stories now.
Yeah, we have the second round pick story out too. I'll mention one of those names right now. I also noted that Amari Allen, who played at Alabama, and John Blackwell, who's committed to Duke, who played at Wisconsin, both separately, without bringing it up, noted that Memphis is notorious for having one of the most grueling pre-draft workout processes, and they will just run you run you out the whole time, and wear you out and try to physically break you down, um, and see how you can perform when you're tired. And so they both were like, "Whoo, yeah, that Memphis workout was something else." So two guys that have already worked out for Memphis there, Amari Allen and John Blackwell. I don't think Blackwell is going to end up at Duke,
Yeah.
for sure.
Zuby Ejiofor is another guy who's already done a Grizzlies workout, and that's the guy who will be in the draft. That could be an interesting guy at 32. I mean, I could see something like that. Um, a couple of teammates of current Grizzlies were in the mix. Alex Caravan, who was Cam Spencer's teammate on the national title team at UConn, and then Braden Smith, who was Zach Edey's point guard on the team. They were in the title game, right, against UConn. So go
Yep.
back to that game. Braden Smith had interviewed with the Grizzlies that morning and said that, as soon as it was done, he texted Zach Edey, say, put in a good word for me. He seemed very serious about wanting to play with the Grizzlies. He seems like the kind of guy they would be into, except they have so many small guards. So I don't know about that. Alex Caravan said he had not had contact with the Grizzlies yet, but he would love to be teammates with Cam Spencer again. You could always use a 6'7" guy who can shoot threes. He was one of the best shooters, at the combine this week.
Um, the other local connections, Felix Okpara and Nate Ament both have met with the Grizzlies, so Tennessee Vols there.
We're calling that
Um,
local Knoxville. All right.
we have a lot of Vols fans in Memphis.
Yeah.
We do. We do. Um,
Fayetteville's
so
closer, I'll note.
it is,
Woo,
but there's probably more
woo,
Vols fans here.
woo
Wouldn't
pig
you say?
suey. Woo pig suey. I don't know.
This is a great question that I don't know the answer to.
I'm not ready to cede that ground.
Who do you think has more fans in Memphis? Ole Miss, Tennessee, or Arkansas?
You're probably right that it's Tennessee just because of the in-state too. Although I think Shelby County, you probably get in-state tuition. Do you get in-state tuition at Arkansas and Mississippi? I don't know the answer to that. I feel like maybe you do because Shelby County's a border county to those states. I mean, Oxford is the closest of the three by far.
Yeah,
So I don't know.
I don't know. I think it'd be a close race between Tennessee and Ole Miss. There's a lot of Ole Miss too.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Not in this draft. There's not.
yeah. Before we get out of here, do you have any additional thoughts on what might happen at 1 and 2? If, as we talked, we both kind of were started It sounded like talking ourselves into maybe the Wizards will take Boozer number one.
Or if there's a trade down to two, maybe Jazz trade up to take the Bance at one, and Wizards trade down to two and take Boozer.
I don't think
like
the
that
Jazz
one.
will do that, actually.
I don't think they would do it at cost. Like, what if it's just an Ace Bailey and that's it? I don't know.
Well, okay, so I actually talked to some Jazz folks
Okay.
who gave me the sense that maybe it would be Peterson at number one on the board, and that a trade was unlikely. I don't
I
know,
think
but you got to think about it this way: if you were the Wizards, you'd want DeBance to number one on every single mock
right.
draft that exists, and if you were the Jazz, you would say from here on out, even if DeBance was your number one guy, you'd be like, "No, we're perfectly happy with Darren Peterson." That's just what it's going to be.
You had 6 weeks until the draft. It's too boring to lock everything in. But I do think the logic of the draft suggests that everyone's first hunch is probably what should happen. Because if there's not a huge gap between 1 and 4, if like that is a tier of players, then why would you give up a lot of stuff to move up within the tier? It's one thing if you're outside the tier moving into the tier, then you have to give up an enormous amount. But if you think those 4 players are a tier are relatively close together and separate from everyone else, why are you giving up a lot to move from 4, 3, or 2 to move up when you know you're going to get one of those guys? And then you layer on top of that the way the teams are constructed. The Wizards don't. Everyone wants the big wing, go-to wing, right? Your Jason Tatum kind of player, right? And Debanza seems like he could be that. He's right there. You could just take him and plug him in. Everybody wants that player. Grizzlies been trying to get that player for 20 years, right? You go back to Zaire Williams and Justice Winslow, whatever. The big wing, right? He's right there. Then you get to Washington and at 2, and they don't really have. I know they have Trey Johnson there, but I'm sorry, Utah at 2. Utah at 2, they have all their bigs, and they have a smaller guard in Keontae George. Like what they need is a wing shooter. Boom, Peterson right there. And you have the Grizzlies who just traded Jaren Jackson, and you get your choice of Boozer or Wilson. And then Chicago, who's I think could be very happy to take whoever the Grizzlies don't take. So those teams could move around or pull surprises, but the logic of it is just for them to do what everyone immediately thought they were going to do. We'll see.
Yeah, Utah's front court's good.
Right.
Markkanen, Jackson, Kessler. Like
And they literally just traded for Jaren Jackson.
I know. So you would have to probably move off of one of those guys, right? If you were going to take Boozer, and do you trust Jaren Jackson to be your starting 5 if it's Kessler?
Right.
I mean, it's difficult.
Peterson's a very good fit with the way
Yeah,
Utah is currently
it's
constructed.
difficult to talk yourself into Boozer to Utah for that
Right.
reason. So I think it's gonna have to be Boozer to Washington if he's not there for Memphis. It won't be to Utah. So anyway, there's a lot to get into. I know a lot of people are juiced about the idea of the Grizzlies trying to trade back up into the first round and add some guards. We will talk about that on a later pod because we got several weeks to talk about this. But thank you for listening. And to all of you that are really hurt by the Brandon Clarke news, our condolences to Brandon's family, the Grizzlies organization, everyone that has struggled with it. Obviously a really difficult topic, but I hope we adequately celebrated his basketball career here in Memphis. For Drew and for Chris, we're out of here.